Margaret Whitfield thought the letter was a mistake until an HOA attorney arrived with a lien, a bulldozed access road, and a 30-day countdown to vacate land her husband's family had held for 3 generations. Board President Preston Holloway smiled like a man revisiting old business. Forged signatures and a rewritten boundary map had already buried her on paper. But Margaret had found something first, a 60-year-old deed the association never knew existed, and a name inside it Preston had spent his whole life trying to bury. Stay until the end and watch how one widow used her husband's silence to destroy a man's empire. The morning it started, Cedar Bend Ridge was quiet in the way only a working ranch can be. 640 acres of Montana grassland, held by the Whitfield family since 1958, long before the Cedar Bend Estates subdivision existed a half-mile down the county road. Margaret Whitfield was 58 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had married into ranch life at 22 and never once regretted it. 14 months a widow, she had learned to run the place alone, learned fences, learned bloat-in cattle, learned the particular silence of a house built for 2. The notice came nailed to her gate. Not mailed, notice of association lien and intent to vacate. It claimed she owed Cedar Bend Estates $142,000 in retroactive membership dues, $58,000 in unapproved structure, fines for a barn her husband's grandfather built in 1961, and $31,000 in administrative costs, over $230,000 for an association she had never joined. Margaret had never signed anything. The ranch predated the HOA by 4 decades. When she called the number on the letter, a man introduced himself as Preston Holloway Roman, 61 years old, president of the Cedar Bend Estates Board. His voice was smooth, unbothered, the voice of a man reading from a script he'd used before. He told her the association's boundary had been redrawn 7 years earlier in a routine annexation, and that inheriting the ranch from her late husband had made her a member automatically. "I'd like to see my signature on that," Margaret said. "That's with our attorney." Preston said, and gave her 30 days. That afternoon, 3 stakes appeared along her private road, painted survey orange, marking a boundary line that didn't exist on any recorded map. An HOA security truck idled at the end of her driveway for 11 minutes before pulling away. That night, Margaret sat on the floor of her husband Wade's office and opened a filing cabinet she had never once touched in 14 months. Inside was a deed dated 1958, older and stranger than she expected, and in the boundary description, a name she recognized from a story she'd only half heard once, years ago, at a family funeral. Earl Holloway, Preston's grandfather, named as an adjoining landowner, tied to a water rights clause that made her chest go tight before she even understood what it meant. Whatever broke Wade's family from the Holloways 2 generations ago wasn't a rumor. It was notarized. Before this goes further, if a stranger told you the land your family bled for wasn't legally yours, would you fight quietly with paperwork, or fight loud? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe the truth eventually finds its way out from under people who bury it, stay with me and consider subscribing. There's a lot more of Margaret's fight still to come. Preston returned 2 days later, this time with Cedar Bend's vice president, Diane Ashcroft, 54, and a man carrying a clipboard who never once wrote anything on it. They photographed her barn, her fence line, her equipment shed, logging each as a community standards violation. Diane handed Margaret an updated boundary map. The new HOA line ran directly through the middle of Margaret's lower pasture, through the only spring-fed water source on the property. The filing date stamped on the map fell on a Sunday when the county recorder's office was closed. Preston offered what he called a fair resolution. Margaret would sign over 210 acres on the eastern side, including the spring. In exchange, every fine would vanish, and she'd keep the house and the rest of the land, provided she never publicly disputed the boundary again. Other families have taken that deal. Diane said, almost gently, "It works out better for everyone." "Is that a threat?" Margaret asked, its history repeating itself. Preston said, "You can choose which side of it you're on." Margaret drove to the county records office the next morning. The clerk, a woman named Rosalind Vance who'd worked there over 20 years, pulled a membership application filed 9 months earlier, signature clearly not Margaret's, generated with the kind of uniform pressure a stylus makes, not a pen. Attached was a notarized affidavit, it claiming Margaret had attended a board meeting on a date she could prove, through old receipts, she'd been in Bozeman with her daughter. The notary's license on that affidavit had expired 3 years before the document was filed. Margaret hired Tessa Marlowe, 44, a property attorney who specialized in fraudulent title cases. Tessa read everything twice and told Margaret plainly, there was no legal mechanism for automatic HOA membership predating the association's own existence. The signature was forged. But Preston had built a paper trail complicated enough to stall any emergency motion for weeks if they moved carelessly. While Tessa drafted an emergency filing, Margaret returned home to find her gate chained shut with an HOA padlock. The document authorizing it was signed by Diane Ashcroft. Printed on paper mimicking a county court letterhead, the seal a stock graphic, not the county's raised emboss. Diane called the sheriff and accused Margaret of trespassing on association property. Sheriff Wyatt Carlson, 55, arrived with 2 deputies, unmoved by Preston's folder of delinquent dues. He compared parcel numbers on the HOA's paperwork against Margaret's original deed. A single digit had been changed. Wyatt ordered the chain removed and made no arrest, though Preston promised, walking away, that next time there'd be a valid court order and no room for Margaret's version of events. That night, reviewing the old 1958 deed again with Tessa's help, Margaret found the clause that had unsettled her days earlier written out in full. Earl Holloway had once tried to claim the spring and the access road running through Whitfield land and lost in writing, in court, 60 years ago. Wade's grandfather had beaten him, and Wade, Margaret realized, had known it. He'd simply never told her, the same way he never mentioned Sam, his estranged brother, or why the Whitfield and Holloway families hadn't spoken at a single wedding or funeral in 3 generations. She called her daughter, Emily. Did Dad ever say why Uncle Sam wouldn't come around Grandpa? Emily was quiet a moment. No, but maybe it's time you asked Uncle Sam yourself. 2 days later, an envelope with no return address appeared in Margaret's mailbox, a photocopied HOA ledger and 1 handwritten line. Check, North Fork Consulting. Tessa traced it to a shell company with no employees and 1 owner, Cedar Bend's treasurer, Marcus Doyle, 49, who it turned out was also Preston Holloway's nephew. Over 3 years, North Fork Consulting had received $680,000 from association funds under vague line items like boundary consulting and emergency valuation. The surveying company that redrew Cedar Bend's boundary map, Holloway Land Solutions, traced back to Preston's own brother, who held no active surveying license. Margaret met Marcus at a diner outside town. He arrived shaking, coffee untouched. He admitted Preston had spent a decade building this, quietly seizing land from families who wouldn't fight back. Always for the water and the access roads, never the houses. Margaret's ranch was the largest prize, because the spring on her eastern acreage fed half the subdivision's promised water rights. Rights Cedar Bend had sold to residents without ever legally owning. 14 other families, Marcus said. Same pattern. Same silence once they'd sold and left. He handed her a flash drive, board emails, meeting minutes, and 1 recording of Preston saying plainly, "Once she's off that land, we clean the paperwork up." After, the next morning, 2 bulldozers idled at Margaret's eastern gate before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Preston stood in front of them dressed like a man attending a ribbon cutting, a forged demolition order in hand, certain this was the day he finally won what his grandfather couldn't. Margaret walked out onto the porch, the 1958 deed rolled under her arm, and did not move. "Last chance, Margaret," Preston called out over the engines. "Sign and none of this has to happen." She didn't answer him. She was watching the road behind him, where a sheriff's cruiser had just turned in through the gate. Sheriff Coulson, with Tessa Marlowe's overnight filing, Marcus's recording, and 60 years of Holloway history, sitting on the seat beside him.